I would like to ask a question about Europe. Europe is undergoing a fundamental transformation in terms of security and energy following to Ukraine war and Iran conflicts. Do you think the European Union is becoming more dependent on the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, clearly the war in Ukraine showed that Europe had made this strategic error by being over-reliant on the Russians, right? So, it's in an energy transition away from Russia. It's cutting Russia out its supply chains. I see no way back. It's been trying to diversify its energy away from Russia, and LNG has been part of that process. So we've seen a lot of investments in LNG terminals in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in Southern Europe. So the US certainly is become an increased market for Europe, right? I mean, Europe, and obviously now, Europe doesn't buy as much energy from the Gulf states, right? Asia is more dependent. But obviously Europe is badly impacted by the war in Iran because it means higher prices for energy. So whether it's buying from America or Russia or the Gulf states, unfortunately it's paying more, right? And that's a supply shock for Europe. Unlike the US, which exports energy, Europe imports energy, right? So that will impact on inflation and growth. And Europe already had, I guess, a competitiveness problem. Its old model was based on competing with China in manufacturing using cheap Russian energy. That's kind of gone, right? So it has to adjust to an environment now with higher energy import costs, I guess with challenges around competitiveness more generally because of, over-regulation. But maybe Europe is beginning to understand the challenges, right? The climate transition is happening, right? I mean, renewables are a larger share of European energy. I mean, there's a refocusing on nuclear as a solution. But Europe has difficulties, undoubtedly, in the war in Iran. The US and Israel attack on Iran was not in Europe's interests, right? I mean, the reluctance of Europe to involve itself in the war in Iran is just a reflection of the fact that its interests are not being represented by US policy at the moment, right? This was detrimental to US interests. It means higher energy import prices, less growth, and that will pressure, the social cohesion in Europe, right? And we're having to spend more on defense. It means less for social spending. Europe's big problem at the moment is rise of populism, far right, far left. Europe being pulled apart, and this war, I think, will not help that.
Ursula von der Leyen stated that Europe should not fall under the influence of Russia, Turkey, or China. However, this was later described as a geopolitical mistake. How do you assess this? And is this a strategic contradiction in the European Union perspective of the Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't understand why she made such a basic mistake. Right? I mean, why would you say that? I mean, I don't get it when, the two biggest challenges to Europe are the existential threat from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's actions to sow division in Europe by backing far right and far left parties, Russian attacks on critical infrastructure, Russia's intervention in elections, backing populist candidates like Orban in Hungary or Radev in Bulgaria or Fico in Slovakia or Babis in Czech Republic. Attacks on cables and critical infrastructure. And even, the reported, attempt to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall, right? I mean, clearly Russia is the existential threat. And then China really, in terms of the competitiveness challenge in terms of Chinese dumping of cheap, autos and manufactured products. They are the two challenges. Like, what is the challenge? I mean, what can she explain what this Turkish challenge is? I mean, and if you look at those, those two challenges from the China and Russia, actually Turkey provides solutions. Turkey has clear capabilities in defense technology, drones. It has a large, the largest military in European NATO, 400,000 regular troops. another 300 in reserve, has thousands of main battle tanks, battle-hardened military. If European NATO is talking about policing a ceasefire deal in Ukraine and deploying tens of thousands of troops for a coalition of the winning, there's only Turkey can do that, right? And then, the irony of a German politician when, in the last few months we've had a major NATO exercise in the Baltics, which included Turkey's helicopter/drone carrier and thousands of Turkish troops helping defend the Baltic Sea for Germany and Turkey's allies in Europe. I mean, the irony is just unbelievable, right? So, I mean, look, unfortunately, I think old prejudices are slow to die and difficult to overcome. And unfortunately, I think, there is, in continental Europe, there are clear, there are Turkey phobes in Europe, right? And there is racism and Islamophobia that, but I'd say, look, there's this great opportunity by these global developments, by Russia's threat on Europe, by the US disengagement from NATO. There's this huge opportunity for another, we had, I guess, with Turkish EU accession, I think 2007 was, I mean, it's been a candidate member state for a long time, but, we had that period until, I guess, the Sarkozy-Merkel privileged partnership that kind of like stopped that process and moved it in a different direction, right? And the two, Turkey and Europe, I guess, have been going in different directions. This provides us an opportunity to come back. And I think we both have common interest. I mean, Europe and Turkey have common interest in countering the threat from Russia. I mean, Turkey has no interest in a Russian victory in Ukraine. That means Russia will control the Black Sea. It will roll back Turkish influence in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. So we have a common interest, right? And I think this is an opportunity to deepen the relationship, which is a natural. We're neighbours. I always think, if you think of Turkey, 2/3 of trade, investment, and financing for Turkey comes from Europe. Turks look to Europe. Generally, Turks don't send their kids to Moscow for education, right? Those that want education outside Turkey would tend to go to Europe or maybe the American, but this is we have the same, we have common interest. I think we just need to put these prejudices behind us and look at and focus on the opportunities.
So conflict around the world are changing political balances, as you know. How does the process affect the global balance of the power?
Look, we live in a multipolar world, clearly. But it's interesting. It's a multipolar world, but I'd actually also argue that increasingly it's driven by personalities and egos, right? You have these big characters, Putin, Xi, Trump, Kim, Orban, Erdogan, perhaps you could also say, MBS, MBZ, and often policy is very personalised. And look, and perhaps sometimes it's not necessarily for the good. I would argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a very personal project for Putin, right? This was not about Russia's interests. This was about Putin's obsession with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the demise of Russia's position in the world, and his personal obsession with Ukraine not being an independent state, not being an independent people, Russian Ukrainians as a single entity and people, right? It was his drive that led to the invasion, disastrous for Russia, right? And destabilizing for Europe, very obviously terrible for Ukraine. Also with Trump in Iran. All the intelligent analysis of the Iranian regime suggested that a military intervention against Iran would not lead to regime change, would embed the regime, breathe new life into the regime, and if the regime faced an existential threat, it would hit out against Gulf states and the Straits, and that's what they did. But in the end, it was a vanity project of Trump. Trump, I think, face clear problems at home, low poll ratings. The Epstein story wouldn't go away. He seemed to be nervous about that. And I think Netanyahu, another of these big leaders who seems to be driving a war agenda for Israel because of his own legal problems at home, somehow convinced Trump that this was a good idea, but it was a catastrophe. So, you have lots of schisms. You've got the China-US battle for hegemony, and then you have these individual leaders that are driving policy, and not necessarily in the interests of their own countries, right? Which is an increasingly complex, interrelated world. Geopolitics is like a much used phrase these days, right? We're all frightened about anything that happens. It's geopolitics, right? Yeah. I mean, geopolitics is like look at the words geopolitics. It's like politics across borders, foreign affairs we used to call it, right? But it's more complex now because I guess in the old days you'd have diplomacy and war. That was kind of geopolitics, right? I mean, now you can use sanctions, statecraft. Russia uses cyber attacks, social media campaigns against other countries. As I said, attacking critical infrastructure and energy, climate change. I mean, it's very complicated. And also we have a world that's much more joined up, and where you have supply chains that cross this geopolitical angle. And we saw in the war in Iran. I mean, look, Iran focused all the time on its nuclear program, its deterrent. That failed, it got its attacked. But actually the new deterrent it found was its an inability to impact on global markets through supply chains, and the fact that the Gulf states have diversified their economies away from oil to lots of other stuff like trade, transport, logistics, tourism, finance, and all of it coming through the straits, and so Iran had the ability to disrupt the global economy, and that gave it leverage, right? So, it's a complicated world, put it that way, and lots of moving parts, and it's about understanding individual countries and these big themes: AI, climate change, sanctions, and then these individual leaders as well.
After the war in the Middle East, the sharp rise in oil prices has raised concern about a new global inflation wave. Do you think the risk of key checkpoints like the Strait of Hormuz could trigger a 1970s style energy crisis?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's not just about energy. As I said, I mean, what's different now is the Gulf states are important for lots of stuff beyond energy. I know Fatih Birol, the IEA chief, said that this is the biggest energy shock in history, which I kind of agree with. Yeah. And I think, even in best case, we have a solution, a deal between Iran and the US. I mean, the Straits is not going to go back to two-flow traffic for like 6 months, right? So we are going to see shortages of jet fuel and other fuel, oil and fuel-related stuff, fertilizer. There's going to be impact, right? And it probably will mean higher inflation because we'll have it'll be very COVID-like. Shortages, individual products in short, so be inflation, and then maybe a growth impact, so stagflationary ultimately. And the other angle is, often with these supply chain issues, we just don't quite, and with a very interconnected global economy, we don't really know where the shock's going to come or where the skeletons are hidden. You may rely on something in your life. I don't know what it could be, but I don't know. Something that could be a driver of your life that you assume you're always going to be able to buy. And maybe suddenly it's not available. Maybe it could be a medicine, or I don't know what it could be, but something really, those kind of things. And so we're going to see disruption, right? And I guess the end result of all this probably will be, supply chain security will become more important. We've been through globalization. We're going to go to autarky, probably. Less efficient global production probably means ultimately higher global inflation, like you would imagine.
So we are also seeing the tensions in the Middle East are disturbing not only energy markets, but also global trade flows. Could this create a lasting structural break in the world economy?
I mean, there are some. I mean, the positives, I guess, going into this are, the US economy was in a pretty strong place as we went into this crisis. Trump would say it's him. I'd say Biden laid some of the strong foundations for growth and employment in the US. Deregulation, tax cuts has helped that economy. So US earnings are looking pretty good. There's the whole AI thing, AI investment kind of bubble ongoing. And emerging markets, many emerging market economies are in probably the best position I've seen for a long time. We've got reform stories, in South Africa, in Argentina. We have the return to orthodoxy in Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan have IMF programs. So and Gulf states, interestingly, have very strong balance sheets. So they have huge resources of sovereign wealth money, trillions of dollars of money in these again, sovereign wealth funds that they can deploy to underpin their economies in this period of dislocation. But at the same time, the sheer scale of the disruption in energy markets and supply chains just makes me really worried that, it feels like COVID, it feels a bit like the global financial crisis of '08. We just don't know where the shocks are going to come from. I am worried. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'm not sure markets are pricing the dislocation in the real economy that we're going to see.
If Iran war continues, how will the Turkish economy be affected?
Well, short term, definitely negative. Unfortunately, Turkey is a big energy importer. The calculations from the central bank are that every $10 increase in the oil price, costs about 3 to 4 billion in terms of energy import costs, dollars, and maybe 5 billion if you include everything else, gas and all those kind of things. And then it adds about 1% to inflation, right? So, Turkey is in the middle of this very difficult adjustment process, the Şimşek program, the disinflation story. It will mean a higher current account deficit. It will mean pressure on the currency. It will mean the central bank will have to use reserves to defend the currency, maybe increase interest rates, which means lower growth. So Turkey will be affected short term, definitely, and unfortunately. And the longer the high oil prices remain high, the longer it goes, the worse it's going to get. The positive is, because of that Şimşek program, Turkey has, resources to defend the currency, record high foreign exchange reserves, close to 200 billion. And it has, there is now some confidence in the central bank. They're more orthodox. You have a good team. I think the market respects Şimşek. It respects Karahan and the team. They have increased interest rates in the past because of shocks. It's painful. No one would want higher interest rates, but this is the reality, right? If you face this external shock, unexpected, you have to adjust. But I think they will do the right thing ultimately. Now, long term, there are opportunities from this. I think the Gulf region is not going back to where it was, right? The whole Gulf model was about diversification on these Vision 2030 Saudi programs based on the back of security provided by two things, the US security umbrella and economic engagement with Iran, right? Both failed, right? The US were not there to defend the Gulf states. And, question marks, if Iran now is willing to hit Gulf states with drones and ballistic missiles, you have to question whether that works. So those countries need an alternative. They need to diversify their security umbrella. And we've seen that, I think, reaching out to Turkey and Pakistan. We have this new Turkey, Saudi, Egypt, Pakistan defense strategic relationship. I think the Gulf states will reach out to Turkey for defense drone capability. And we've also seen this effort by Saudi Arabia to build a new trade corridor through Syria, Jordan, Turkey to export energy and I guess other products to Europe. So Turkey will benefit from that. We may see Turkey benefit from tourism flows. I'm not sure many people are going to go back to Dubai. It's kind of, if it's not secure, if it's not perceived as secure, there's issue there. And I know that the Erdogan administration have been talking about tax breaks and investment incentives for international business to relocate to Turkey. So maybe that's an opportunity, right? But, bottom line is, again, for Europe, for the Gulf, Turkey provides defense and security solutions because the US is no longer reliable.